it is obscuring a bigger picture here, which is actually, as I said, the government's given masses of material to the inquiry, and the inquiry needs to get on and do its job, because the bigger...
Well, they are doing that. They're getting on with it in the meantime.
Well, I know but they need to. There's a danger here that we have another pandemic before the inquiry has reported.
Time for our regular WTF panel, talking through the week that finished. Today I'm joined by Conservative peer and former Tory leader William Hague and Labour peer Angela Smith. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Cathy.
Well, now, this was the week that the government and the COVID inquiry have been at loggerheads over which material should and shouldn't be passed on to the inquiry chair, Baroness Hallett. The Cabinet Office is arguing that many of the messages are not relevant and that to hand them over would compromise ministers' privacy and hamper future decision-making. And they've decided to seek a judicial review. Science Minister George Freeman told the BBC the government would likely lose its legal challenge.
You've got to have a situation where parliamentarians, ministers can talk in private and exchange, and it's the oil of good democracy. It has been since the day of Cicero. But of course, the minute you write it down, it is in writing. And I think the best advice is probably, if you don't want it ever to be subpoenaed or taken out of context, don't write it down. But everyone's rushing around 24/7, messaging each other.
The judge who's on the inquiry set up by the government, who appointed this judge, is saying it's up to her to decide what's relevant.
It's now sub judice, and I can't really comment on it. But
come on, George. Do you agree with the government? You agree with the government?
I'm answering your question. I have to be careful, but I would tell you that I would be very surprised if a court doesn't take that view.
Well, earlier today we heard that Boris Johnson was handing over all his unredacted WhatsApp messages, and within the last half hour, Caroline Dinenage, who was a social care minister at the beginning of the pandemic, told us that she too had already handed over all her WhatsApp messages. William Hague, what is all the fuss about? Does the government need to just back down and just hand over everything the inquiry demands?
Well, it's a good question, of course, what the fuss is about, because clearly a lot of people think they have nothing to hide. They're handing over their messages, including Boris Johnson. And bear in mind, the government, the Cabinet Office, will have handed over a vast amount of material to this inquiry already, quite rightly. But what it's all about is the apparent demand of the inquiry to see the messages that are not necessarily relevant to it. In other words, they want to decide what is relevant to it, whereas in all previous inquiries, including ones I've set up in the past, it was the Cabinet Office or the government that said, well, here's the relevant material. So the argument is really about that for the future, and whether that makes inquiries more complicated, whether that inhibits ministers discussing things and officials that aren't relevant in previous year, in future situations to any future inquiry. That is really what the argument is about. I take the side of the Cabinet Office, but now it will be decided in court.
But William, aren't you really taking the side of Rishi Sunak? Because as I was chatting to Caroline Dinenage earlier in the programme, she just couldn't understand why ministers didn't just hand it all over. I think a lot of people will assume that Rishi Sunak has got something to hide.
No, I don't. I've no idea. I doubt it very much that he's got anything to hide. But I do, as I say, I set up an inquiry when I was Secretary of State for Wales, and so I remember the rules about these things. I think what the government is doing is not hiding anything from anybody. They are trying to make sure the precedent isn't set for the future. Right. That an inquiry chair can demand things that are, in the opinion of the Cabinet Office, unambiguously irrelevant. That is their phrase.
Well, Angela,
so I think it's genuinely what it's all about.
Angela Smith, if your party wins the election, you might be quite grateful that a precedent has been established and you don't have to have everybody pore over all your WhatsApp messages and ministerial communications in private.
Well, I thought the great wisdom there from George Freeman, I wrote it down as he said it. The minute you write something down, it's in writing, which seemed to me a strange thing for him to have said. But, I think what I find odd about this whole inquiry is about truth and it's about trust. And what the Cabinet Office is saying is, trust us, we know the truth, you are going to get what's relevant and not other things, like as William said. But what I find extraordinary is when government ministers are saying, we won't win this, but we're going to use public money to test the case. It's like a soap opera that you can't quite believe is true, really, isn't it? If you wrote this in a novel, nobody would believe you possibly be true at all. They think that's nonsense. I'm not going to publish it.
It's not a good look, William, is it? And it does. I was saying rather facetiously, as usual, maybe Rishi Sunak's got something to hide. But when the whole thing, as Angela's just said, is about trust and openness, it doesn't sit well with that, does it?
Well, it becomes a very confusing argument, and I don't know why George Freeman said they'd lose it. I mean, they might lose it, but if I was a government minister, on the grounds I was giving earlier, I'd be reasonably optimistic that the government might win the case. But it is obscuring a bigger picture here, which is actually, as I said, the government's given masses of material to the inquiry, and the inquiry needs to get on and do its job, because the bigger...
Well, they are doing that. They're getting on with it in the meantime.
Well, I know but they need to. There's a danger here that we have another pandemic before the inquiry has reported. So John Bell said this week there was a 30% chance of another pandemic in the next decade.
Oh,
we do have a habit, including inquiries I've been part of setting up in the past, where they take years and years, whereas they're most useful if they report within at least 3 years of being set up. Well, this was set up 2 years ago. They need to get on and do that.
Doesn't the legal action just delay things more? Boris Johnson said, I've got the information, here you are, you can have it. That would move things along much more quickly. I think this one, it just seems quite murky. If Boris Johnson, who the inquiry is about, says, I've got the information, I want it to be seen, here it is, surely we can move forward quite quickly. But I think William's right. I set up an inquiry when I was a minister as well, and it took years and years. I was well out of that job. I was miles away by the time it reported, and that doesn't serve justice well at all. Yeah. So let's get on with it. But if Boris Johnson's got the information, he wants to hand it over, let's get on with it.